late in the 1930s, William Randolph Hearst and the actress Marion Davies reportedly believed they were finally close to marrying. PBS's documentary, Citizen Hearst, describes a divorce agreement with Hearst's legal wife, Millicent, that was nearly finished. Then, Cosmopolitan magazine turned up in the property negotiations. Hearst would not let the business empire into the settlement, so he walked away from the divorce, and Millicent stayed his wife until he died. By that point, he had spent years with Marion in California, and Millicent had built a separate life in New York. The easy version of the story says an abandoned wife refused to let go. It is worth asking instead whether remaining Mrs. Hearst kept Millicent trapped in a marriage that had already ended, or whether it preserved the only power in that marriage still belonging to her. Welcome back to Gilded Women, where we look beyond the perfect image to the woman history left behind. This is not a story about a wife defeating a mistress. 3 people kept an arrangement running for decades because ending it would have cost each of them something they did not want to give up. Hearst wanted Marion, but not at the price of dismantling the world that carried his name. Marion shared his private life and could not legally take that name, and Millicent had no way to make her husband come home. What she could decide was what she would surrender in order to let him go. Before she was Mrs. Hearst, she was Millicent Wilson, a young stage performer in New York. She worked with her older sister, Anita, in an era when the theater could give a girl an income and an audience without giving her respectability. The stage put Millicent in front of wealthy men who came to Broadway for an evening's entertainment, though never on equal footing with them. She met William Randolph Hearst while she was still a teenager. He was in his 30s, rich, and already an established publisher. Sources disagree about her exact age at the first meeting, so putting a number on it would claim more certainty than the record supports. The gap between their positions is not in doubt. Hearst had family money, newspapers, employees, and the freedom of a grown man used to being accommodated. Millicent had youth, talent, beauty, and a job that polite society tended to view with suspicion. None of that proves coercion, and it does not mean Millicent had no say. She kept seeing Hearst over a period of years, and the early meetings reportedly happened under supervision. His attention could be exciting and flattering, and it could change her life. But a young performer's choice never carried the same practical weight as the choice of a millionaire publisher who could rearrange the conditions she lived in. Hearst had been drawn to actresses, dancers, and theater women for years. His mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, kept trying to steer him toward a more conventional life. She controlled much of the family money he still depended on, and her approval carried weight even with a son famous for ignoring other people's rules. So Millicent walked into a romance and, at the same time, into a family argument about class, respectability, and who was fit to marry into a great American fortune. In the spring of 1903, Millicent married Hearst at Grace Church in New York. Phoebe did not come. She later admitted that a good many people seemed to like her new daughter-in-law, but skipping the wedding said everything about how she felt at the time. Millicent had married one of the most ambitious men in the country, and her first job was proving that her years on the stage did not disqualify her from being his wife. That took more than a new wardrobe and a new address. Mrs. Hearst was expected to look composed, standing next to a man who made his living generating controversy. His papers were aggressive, sensational, and openly combative in politics, His wife supplied the counterweight: family, stability, manners, social order. Her stage training did not go to waste. It simply went into a different kind of performance. They had 5 sons. George came first, then William Jr. and John, and later the twins, Randolph and David. The household gave Hearst the outward shape of a family man, while his work and his appetites kept pulling him elsewhere. Millicent held the domestic side together. She was raising children and also keeping up the continuity of a name that would eventually pass through those boys. She stood beside him through his political campaigns. He served in Congress and lost bids for mayor and governor of New York, among other ambitions. A candidate's wife was supposed to signal respectability without looking politically threatening herself, and Millicent understood the assignment. Next to a man whose newspapers had made him both famous and feared, she helped present him as a husband and father who belonged in public office. Her theater years may have prepared her for some of that work. A campaign platform and a receiving line are not a vaudeville stage, but they ask for the same things: timing, composure, a sense of what the audience needs. Millicent knew how to walk into a room, hold attention without stepping on her husband's, and keep smiling well past the point where the evening had stopped being pleasant. That labor was easy to overlook. Society treated a skilled political wife as though her poise had arrived on its own, with no rehearsal behind it. It would be too easy to say Hearst married her only to fix his image. The respectability helped him, no question, but usefulness and affection can sit in the same marriage. Their early years together included appearances, travel, children, and stretches of real companionship. The record left behind cannot measure private feeling. What it does show is that the marriage served emotional purposes as well as public ones long before it turned into the arrangement it is remembered for. She got something out of it too. The Hearst name brought her houses, servants, money, influence, and entry into political and social circles that would once have looked straight past a chorus girl. And she learned to work the name rather than just wear it. Being Mrs. Hearst supported her children, widened her public work, and turned a former performer into one of the best-known society women in New York. It cost her something as well. PBS's Citizen Hearst describes her leaving most of her show business identity behind as she settled into life as a society matron. On the stage, the applause had been for her, under her own name. Marriage was far safer, but the part she played now was defined through her husband. Long before Marion Davies appeared, Millicent had already learned that becoming Mrs. Hearst meant letting one version of herself fade out. For years, she played the public role well. She raised the boys, turned up at formal events, backed the campaigns, and managed everything society expected of the family. Photographs put her next to Hearst and the children, not hidden away, but standing where the officially recognized woman of the household stood. She had a place. The trouble was that the place rested on a marriage whose private reality would eventually drift completely out of her hands. Marion Davies came into Hearst's life through a world Millicent knew from the inside. Marion was a young performer, too. She was born in Brooklyn, worked in musical productions, and landed in the chorus of an Irving Berlin show. Somewhere in the middle of the 1910s, Hearst spotted her from the audience. He was in his 50s. She was still in her teens. How closely that beginning resembles Millicent's own is one of the most important facts in this story. History later filed the two of them under opposite headings: the dignified wife in New York and the glamorous companion in California. Both, though, started as young women from the stage who caught the eye of the same much older and enormously wealthy man. What separated them was not character. It was timing and which position each of them was offered. Hearst promised to make Marion a star. He set up a production company and poured money into her film career. That kind of backing opened doors most actresses never got near, and it handed him extraordinary control. He weighed in on scripts, casting, publicity, costumes, even her hair. His devotion paid for her career, and his judgment kept fencing it in. Citizen Kane later taught generations to remember Marion as a talentless woman promoted by a powerful lover, which was unfair to her. She had a real gift for comedy and mimicry. People who worked with her talked about her timing, her warmth, and her willingness to look ridiculous if it got a laugh. Hearst preferred grand romantic parts that showed off her beauty and her dignity. In trying to elevate her, he kept steering her away from the comic work she was actually better at. So what Millicent faced was not a passing affair. Hearst and Marion built a partnership that outlasted career disappointments, money trouble, age, illness, and decades of public vagueness about what they were to each other. Marion was not collecting presents while she waited for something better. Whatever the relationship was at the start, it turned into lasting attachment and loyalty, none of which makes the injury to Millicent any smaller. Hearst kept a marriage going while he built a second life. In the early years of the affair, he was seeing Marion in New York while Millicent lived elsewhere in the same city with the family. The PBS account is clear that we cannot always know what Millicent knew or what she asked at any given stage. The double life continued because Hearst had the money and the power to keep it running. By 1921, she had seen the sprawling promotion for Marion in a Hearst production and had gone to the editors to complain that the publicity was about the actress rather than the picture. That is documented, and it tells us she was suspicious and paying attention. No dramatic private confrontation is needed to explain it. Her husband's newspapers were helping build another woman's fame, and it was there on the page for anyone to read. One of the Hearst sons later recalled a rare family confrontation at Christmas in 1922. Millicent threw her wedding ring on the floor and told Hearst, in substance, that if the marriage meant so little to him, he could keep it. There is no point inflating that into a full scene, since the details were never recorded. What survives is enough. The woman who could hold her composure through an entire campaign had reached the point where the official symbol of her marriage no longer matched anything real. Hearst did not end the affair. The family settled into a new pattern instead. Millicent stayed mostly in the East, while Hearst spent more and more of his time with Marion in California. Geography became the way they managed a conflict none of the three could solve. A continent now sat between the legal household and the private partnership. San Simeon was the most visible piece of Hearst's California life. When his mother died in 1919, he inherited a great deal of land along the central California coast. With the architect Julia Morgan, he set about turning a family camping spot into the estate he named La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. Building went on for close to 30 years. In the end, it held a vast main house, guest houses, pools, gardens, terraces, and art and architectural pieces collected from all over the world. It was still unfinished in 1947 when failing health forced Hearst to leave. The size of the place made it look permanent. It was really a project under constant revision, run by a man who changed the plans whenever some new possibility caught him. Marion was the hostess people associated with San Simeon. Film stars, politicians, writers, and business leaders made the trip up the hill. A day there might include riding, swimming, a screening, an elaborate dinner, and a tour of the collections. The photographs turned the place into a picture of private American royalty, with Hearst and Marion at the head of a world their wealth had made possible. That picture has encouraged a misleading idea that Marion was living in a castle taken from Millicent. San Simeon was never Millicent's private home, and no rival stole it from her. It was Hearst's, and it grew into the center of the Western life he chose with Marion. Millicent was not shut out of it either. The family arrangement reportedly let her use the property at separate times, including stretches when Hearst and Marion were in the East. The distinction matters. The injustice here was never a stolen building. It was that Hearst could build two enormous lives rather than pick one and live with the consequences. Millicent could be Mrs. Hearst in New York and still visit a family property in California. Marion could preside over San Simeon and still have no legal recognition as Hearst's wife. Hearst moved between the two worlds, and both women held positions that existed at his preference. Money is what made the arrangement survivable. An ordinary family split by an affair runs into shared rooms, limited income, and urgent decisions about who lives where. Hearst could hand Millicent a grand estate on Long Island, keep up residences in New York, pay for Marion's houses and pictures, and go on building San Simeon. The wealth did not settle anything about the marriage. It took away most of the pressures that would otherwise have forced a settlement. For Millicent, the distance cut both ways. It made the rejection visible, since her husband's companion was openly established on the other coast, entertaining in the house most identified with his private life. The same distance also gave Millicent room to stop arranging her days around his movements. She had houses, children, friendships, and public work in New York. The marriage stayed on paper, and she no longer had to act as though the household ran like anybody else's. For Marion, San Simeon gave intimacy and status, without the one recognition that would have settled it. In California, she was the hostess and the companion, the woman at Hearst's side. In law, in the family, and in formal society, Millicent was still his wife. Nothing about Marion's prominence could touch the document signed at Grace Church. Hearst seems to have believed that money, distance, and good manners could make this acceptable to everybody involved. The evidence points the other way. Millicent had the status and not the husband. Marion had the husband's company and not the status she reportedly wanted. Hearst kept both women in their separate roles and kept putting off the one decision that would have cost him something. So why did Millicent stay married to him? There is no single answer. Faith was part of it. Millicent was Catholic, and divorce carried religious consequences. It carried social ones, too, for a woman of her generation and standing. The early 20th century did not judge divorced men and divorced women by the same standard. A rich man could carry on with his social life after a public separation. A woman who had spent decades becoming a respected matron risked being treated as though the collapse of the household were partly her doing. By then, the name Mrs. Hearst described far more than who she had married. It was her public identity. She had campaigned under it, raised 5 sons under it, gone out in society under it, and built her philanthropic standing under it. Walking away would not have handed her back the young performer she used to be. It would more likely have stripped her of the position she had spent her whole adult life learning to hold. The 5 sons were another part of it. A legal separation could have shifted property negotiations, inheritance expectations, and the internal balance of a family business meant to pass to the next generation. Nothing supports the claim that all 5 boys insisted their mother stay married, or that every one of them took her side in every dispute. What can be said is that her position as Hearst's wife also protected her position as the mother of his heirs. The boys also gave the marriage a future that outran their parents. Hearst was no longer just a personal fortune 2 adults could divide. It was turning into a dynasty with newspapers, trusts, property, and corporate authority expected to carry on into another generation. Millicent's legal position put her inside that line of continuity. A divorce could be worked out in financial terms. It could not easily separate the identity of 5 boys from the marriage that had produced them. Money mattered, and saying so does not turn Millicent into a greedy woman. Marriage came with legal and financial rights that companionship simply did not. Hearst's empire ran to newspapers, magazines, property, art, and investments whose value could climb, collapse, and climb again. A settlement would have meant converting the loose protections of marriage into terms someone had to argue over. Staying married kept her claims and her leverage intact, without asking her to trust a final agreement drafted around Hearst's priorities. Social position mattered too. Invitations, charitable donations, political access, and public attention all followed the Hearst name, and Millicent used those advantages. Pretending otherwise would romanticize how independent she was. Having access to resources does not cancel out the work she did with them. Whether the name had value was never in question. What is worth asking is whether holding on to that value was self-protection, an acceptance of confinement, or both at once. Pain may have played a part as well. A marriage can go on legally after the companionship is gone, because the shared history is the hard thing to divide. Millicent had known Hearst since she was young. She had borne and raised 5 sons. She had stood through campaigns, controversies, the endless expansion of the newspapers, and the building of a family dynasty. Divorce would not have simply released an absent husband. It would have forced a legal accounting of decades of work nobody could give back to her. There may also have been anger, though anger is not proof of revenge. Millicent had every reason to resent a situation arranged around Hearst's wishes. That does not mean every negotiation was designed to punish Marion. A woman can defend property and status because they are practically worth defending, even when the defense happens to frustrate the people who want her to give them up. By the late 1930s, the marriage came far closer to a formal end than the usual telling admits. In PBS's Citizen Hearst, the historian Lara Gabrielle describes a divorce agreement sitting there waiting to be completed. Hearst and Marion reportedly made preparations in Mexico on the expectation that once it went through, they could marry. Then Cosmopolitan magazine came into the property negotiations. The magazine was an important part of Hearst's business world. By the PBS account, Hearst would not accept a personal settlement colliding with his media empire, and he decided not to go through with the divorce. That one detail changes the shape of the whole story. Millicent did not spend the years refusing every possible divorce until Hearst died. She had taken part in an agreement. When she brought a significant business asset into the negotiation, Hearst decided the price was too high. Her demands are part of why it collapsed. The refusal at the end was his. Why she wanted Cosmopolitan included cannot be known for certain. It might have been financial protection, leverage, a valuable asset she wanted for herself and her sons, or all of that at once. The evidence does not let anyone declare that she asked for it purely to keep Marion from marrying. Property negotiations are fights about power, because the assets are worth something apart from anybody's feelings. Hearst wanted to keep control of the business that carried his name. Millicent wanted terms she could actually accept after decades of marriage. Neither of them moved. Marion, who had waited years for the chance at a legal marriage, was left holding the consequences of a negotiation she could not control. The PBS account describes the disappointment as severe. The marriage lasted, but not because it was still working as a marriage. It lasted because ending it would have cost each of them something they considered essential. Millicent would have had to take a settlement without the terms she wanted. Hearst would have had to let part of his business into the divorce. Marion had already spent years without legal recognition as his wife, and now she was being asked to keep waiting. So staying Mrs. Hearst was protection and confinement in the same breath. It kept her name, her rights, her position in the family, and her leverage. It also kept intact the structure that let her husband live openly with another woman and never face a final division. A legal win restored nothing emotionally. Hearst never came back to the marriage in any ordinary sense. It was not a simple defeat either. Millicent did not spend those decades sitting in an empty room waiting for a man in California to come home. Even before the separation hardened into something permanent, she had started building a public identity out of service and philanthropy. During the First World War, she supported programs for troops overseas and for wounded veterans once they came home. That work made her visible in a way society photographs and campaign appearances never had. She could organize, raise money, put influential donors in the same room, and attach the Hearst name to needs that had nothing to do with the family. Her reputation grew enough that, according to the PBS documentary, her name came up at one point in connection with a possible run for Congress. She never built a political career, but the fact that anyone floated the idea shows how far she had moved past the role of the silent candidate's wife. Her husband's name got her in the door. What she did with the access after that was her own. The charity she is most associated with is the Free Milk Fund for Babies, generally dated to 1921. The purpose was plain enough: get milk to children in poor New York families. Public nutrition programs had not yet grown into what they later became, so help like that could matter immediately in a household struggling to feed infants and young children. The fund also gave her an ongoing public role. She turned up at benefit performances, radio broadcasts, holiday distributions, and events with civic leaders. Photographs held by the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, document her involvement in 1935, 1940, and repeatedly in 1949. That is a record of continuity, not one ceremonial appearance. In a roundabout way, it also brought her back to the world of performance she had given up. A benefit needs theaters, musicians, broadcasters, public figures, and an audience willing to give. She could work those entertainment and society networks without going back to being the young woman on display. This time, the evening served an institution tied to her own public name and a cause she had chosen. One photograph shows her at a benefit for the fund. Another catches her in the middle of a radio broadcast. Later images name her as founder and president at a film premiere, and one places her with children at a Christmas gathering for the families the fund served. None of this tells us how the organization was run day to day or how many hours a week she gave it. It does establish that the fund stayed part of her public work for decades. Her wealth and her connections were central to all of it. She did not conjure the resources out of nothing. The Hearst papers could supply publicity. The family name could pull in donors, entertainers, politicians, and venues. Her social circle made putting a benefit together far easier than it would have been for an unknown woman without money. Privilege and idleness are not the same thing, though. Plenty of people have that kind of access and never build anything lasting with it. Millicent took a name built by a controversial media empire and attached it to babies, veterans, and New York families who needed help. The work does not cancel out the advantages behind it. The advantages do not make the work vanish either. Her houses in New York and on Long Island became the center of a life that had less and less to do with her husband's California household. She stayed close to her sons, kept up her society relationships, and built routines that did not depend on an invitation to San Simeon. The distance that let the failed marriage continue also gave her the room to decide what Mrs. Hearst meant on the eastern side of the country. What she made of it was not fully independent and not simply borrowed. The name was still his. The money was still tied to the fortune and the companies he had built. But the events she attended, the causes she picked, and the family positions she held up were her own daily responsibility. She could not control where her husband lived. She could shape what his name stood for in New York. It was a quieter kind of power than his. He owned printing presses, swayed elections, put up buildings, and set stories in front of millions of readers. Hers worked through family legitimacy, social networks, charitable institutions, and the legal position he had never dissolved. It could not order him home. It could make leaving her complicated. The press system around Hearst helped the arrangement hold. By the 1930s, his empire took in 28 newspapers, 13 magazines, a movie studio, a wire service, and radio stations. He had built his influence by deciding what counted as news and how the public ought to understand it. The relationship with Marion was not really a secret. People in New York, Hollywood, publishing, and politics either knew or suspected. But the press barons kept an informal restraint about one another's private lives. A newspaper culture that made money on scandal turned careful when the scandal belonged to one of its own owners. That silence did not erase Millicent. She still appeared in public as Hearst's wife and as a philanthropist. It did not erase Marion, whose film career and place beside Hearst were there for anyone to see. What it protected was the arrangement. The papers could keep the respectable family picture in one column and let the California partnership exist in another, and nobody had to force the two together every morning. Millicent got something out of that protection. The press went on recognizing her official place. She could raise money and walk into public events without every appearance turning into a fresh account of her humiliation. The privacy gave her room to build a separate life. It also spared Hearst any accounting for running two households on his own terms. The irony is hard to miss. Hearst had made a fortune shaping stories about politicians, criminals, workers, celebrities, wars, and every kind of social scandal. His own family story got a caution no ordinary person who landed in his papers was ever offered. The power to define public reality helped keep his private reality from ever reaching a final reckoning. Citizen Kane muddied the memory further. The film took its inspiration from Hearst without being a reliable biography of him, Millicent, or Marion. Its portrait of an untalented woman promoted by a tycoon did the most damage to Marion. For Millicent, it created a different kind of absence. The legal wife who had raised 5 sons and built a public life of her own was nowhere near the center of the myth. The women ended up as supporting figures again, in a story about the scale of Hearst's power. On August 14, 1951, William Randolph Hearst died at 88. He had spent his last decades with Marion, and he died legally married to Millicent. Each woman held a different kind of recognition. Marion had the private house and the daily company. Millicent had the position that law, family, and formal ceremony acknowledged. After his death, Millicent traveled west from New York for the funeral in San Francisco. Marion did not attend. Her absence says nothing about how much she had mattered to Hearst. It shows what a private position is worth once the official family takes charge of the public rights. The estate produced one last unexpected exchange of power. According to the account in PBS's Citizen Hearst, he left Marion voting rights attached to the controlling stock of the Hearst Corporation. For a short while, the woman who had never been allowed to become his wife held influence over the company carrying his family name. PBS also recounts that Marion signed those rights back over to Mrs. Hearst for the nominal legal payment of $1. That should not be turned into evidence of some secret friendship between them. They did not have to be friends. Marion may have recognized where the family institutionally stood, stayed loyal to what she believed Hearst wanted, or simply decided that control of his company was not a future she wanted to claim. The transfer also kept the story from ending in a clean victory. Marion did not use Hearst's death to seize the empire. Millicent did not get a restored marriage out of it. The legal wife recovered the family's corporate position, and the longtime companion handed back a form of power she had only ever held after the man who connected all 3 of them was gone. Marion married another man not long after. Millicent went on with her life in New York and stayed Mrs. Hearst until she died in 1974, outliving her husband by more than 2 decades. Those last years did not belong to a marriage waiting to be repaired. They belonged to the identity, the family, and the public position she had already built. So was Millicent, trapped inside a marriage that had ended in everything but law. Or did remaining, Mrs. Hearst, become a form of power she refused to surrender? Both things were true at the same time. The marriage limited her. It tied her to a man whose long partnership with another woman was common knowledge in their world. It held in place a public arrangement in which she carried the dignity of the Hearst name, while he enjoyed freedoms she was never going to get. Staying married did not bring him back, and it did not make Marion any less important to him. The marriage also protected her. It kept her legal rights, her authority in the family, her financial leverage, her social access, and her standing as the mother of 5 Hearst sons. It gave her the resources she put into veterans, children, charitable programs, and a New York life of her own. Those benefits were real, even though they came out of a structure that had hurt her. Marion did not win in any ordinary sense. She got companionship, devotion, money, and decades at the center of Hearst's private life. And she never became his wife. Millicent did not win just because the marriage certificate outlasted everything. She kept the title without the shared life it was supposed to describe. Hearst was the one with the most freedom and the most power. He kept 2 households running, maintained 2 public images, and put off the legal decision until it no longer had to be made. His money let the arrangement last. It never made the arrangement fair. Millicent Hearst was not simply an abandoned wife, and she was not secretly triumphant either. Staying Mrs. Hearst preserved real power, and it preserved the structure that had wounded her. She never defeated Marion Davies, and never forced William Randolph Hearst to come home. What she did was build. Inside a marriage she could not fully repair, and would not dissolve on terms she could not accept. A life that did not disappear when her husband left the room. If Millicent Hearst's story changed the way you see the woman behind the Hearst name, subscribe to Gilded Women as we continue uncovering the private lives hidden behind America's most powerful families. Why do you think Millicent remained Mrs. Hearst? Faith, her 5 sons, financial protection, social position, or the power the marriage still gave her?